where they go shopping in town. Diesel.
Am I live? Sorry. No, not live. Am I getting any more? Here. Yes? Okay, I've got a yes from the back. My name is Heather Dowdy. I'm Deputy Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts. And my first job in state government was in the Office of the Cultural Advisor to Governor Casey. I was not with Sandra at the time. I was with her successor, Dorothy Reddington, also from Scranton. But I wanted to say that Sandra is a legend, as all of you probably know, and she has been an inspiration for me in my career as an arts administrator and as a public servant. So it is my pleasure to introduce her. She is a member of the first class of Governor's Arts Awards recipients, which included Jimmy Stewart, so 1980. And it is such a pleasure to have her part of this event in Scranton and kicking everything off. So.
It's a great pleasure for me to be involved in this and to have Heather introduce me. So here we are. As director of the Schemmel Forum at the University of Scranton, I am honored to have the opportunity to moderate this discussion on the arts and the public good. Uniquely, for this uniquely auspicious occasion, the Governor's Awards for the Arts being presented in Scranton in this remarkable building. Governor Wolf presenting these awards to worthy recipients is the existential evidence that we in Pennsylvania recognize that the arts are not a private luxury, but a public good. I'm proud to say that we in Scranton and Lackawanna County have acknowledged the public role that the arts and culture play in enriching the life of this community. We have Scranton Tomorrow, a 25-year-old generation founded to bring more civic and cultural strength to our area. Scranton Tomorrow has brought us First Friday, movies downtown, planting and planning, festivals, and it's fair to say that we would not be able to host the Governor's Awards today without it. So thank you so much. We have a cultural position at the county level with Maureen McGuigan, who is here, creating a host of cultural programs for people of all ages. And we have artists represented here in this room, in all art forms, working and living with us. We Americans may have taken a while longer than some nations to acknowledge our appreciation of the arts as a public good, but let's look at our public architecture, the public library and the children's library next door, the city hall across the street, the county courthouse, and the federal courthouse downtown. It is no accident that they are objects of beauty, reflecting our respect for government, respect for beauty, and respect for our community. And the private sector followed the lead. Make note of the Everhart Museum in Naog Park if you haven't seen it, and this Masonic temple, designed by Raymond Hood, one of the architects of Rockefeller Center. I would say that our forebears knew something about the arts as a public good, that the arts are not secondary or expendable, that the artistic evidence we leave behind will define to future generations who we were and who we are as a people. It is in that jubilant context that we have this discussion today. Our panelists, from their own personal perspectives, will muse publicly on the importance of the arts, and I will add I can't help but add the humanities to our well-being as individuals and as a community. Let me introduce them to you. Following that, I will ask each of them a question and then engage in some intra-panel discussion. Following that, we will invite all of you to join the discussion with your questions and comments. And so, on my right, they're all on my left. On my left. Nothing political about that. Henry Amoroso, financial consultant to the city of Scranton, and I might add to many other cities and significant entities. Am I right that the Vatican is one of them? Yes, okay. Erica Funke, there, whose voice is surely familiar to you even if you've never met. She is a senior producer and classical music host at our own NPR station, WVIA. Mary Sue Sweeney Price, is the retired director of the Newark Art Museum, former national president of Art Table, an organization of distinguished women administrators in the visual arts, and a part-time resident of Pennsylvania. And Nancy Sanderson, executive director of the Northeastern Pennsylvania Philharmonic. If I were to go into their bios, we would not have time for this discussion at all, so we'll go right to the quick. Henry, I recall that when you agreed to serve as financial consultant to the City of Scranton, there was an aesthetic dimension to your decision. Can you talk about that and how that played into your acceptance of the position?
Sure.
See if that works, then, yeah. Would you?
Do you want us to stand, or? I can
What
speak
do
pretty
you
loud. I'm not
oh,
sure if you folks
okay,
can hear me in the back.
Okay, and he'll pick that up for,
Do you
try
want
it
to
that
stand?
way.
Is that better?
Well, sit and see if people
Okay.
in the back can hear you.
Well, thank you very much, Sandra. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you in the Schemmel Forum. And thank you, my fellow panelists, for agreeing as well to be here on this summer day. I first came to Scranton in 2013, and that was the first time I had been to Scranton. I'd certainly passed through Scranton, but I had not been to Scranton. And my work is generally with distressed cities. Distressed cities who, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, have seen a downward spiral, both economically and physically, for all the reasons you might completely understand, starting with large outmigration of population, changing in economics around whatever the labor force might be, or the primary economics around a particular municipality or city. And some of those cities where I've had the privilege to do work do not have an ability to easily recover. Their only real means of recovery is through significant state intervention. And sadly, our states are very different on how they intervene and what resources they themselves have for purposes of helping a city. But I could not help noting when first coming to Scranton, driving into the city and seeing the university up to my right as I came off the exit ramp, seeing a sign that was actually painted, as opposed to some of the cities where I go where there are old banner signs from the 70s and 80s and they're somewhat distressed looking themselves. But I also did notice, staying here that first night, that the Electric City light sign, most of it was out. And that's a significant measurement for me relative to some of the places that I go to. Many of you might know, for example, Trenton, New Jersey, which has a very famous little metal bridge that is mostly visible from the train line that says Trenton makes, the world takes. 2/3 of that sign have been out for over 10 years as the city struggles with its own economic recovery. But being here in Scranton, I saw something else that immediately impressed me even before I met all the impressive people I met. I've had the pleasure of meeting these past 5 years, was the physical structure that makes up the city, looking at the buildings themselves. So we arrived the day before with my team and we drove around the city and looked at parks. We always look at parks first to see if the city is spending money or has the money to spend on parks. And we sometimes look at the difference between county parks and city parks, because counties sometimes have more resources relative to the parks than the city does. And that's not always visible or realized by the citizenry. We looked at some of the older buildings and what uses those older buildings had, whether they've been empty, how they have been repurposed, if they've been repurposed at all. Looked at some of the fabulous housing in neighborhoods. And I really, as I said, knew nothing about the city, but I was coming to realize that there were many vibrant neighborhoods. I'd obviously done some reading about the city before I came here, but I was just so impressed with the physical nature of the city, the quality of the buildings. In some of the cities where we do work, historic preservation is always very important. And historic preservation should often be the priority in redeveloping and repurposing properties. But sometimes it's not possible. And a process needs to be put in place where, whether it be developers, the city, the county, or the state, a process must be put in place to exhaust all options relative to preservation before losing a facility or a building, but at the same time is being realistic about what that community might need and what it might need to rebuild itself. In Scranton, you had wonderful preservation. You have a fine city hall. I'm happy to read articles that the city is looking for means by which to invest in City Hall. But the work I do often is cut budgets. I'm usually the least popular person at a party. When I walk into a city, people often say, "Oh, here he is," because they know my immediate recommendation is to cut spending. But it's not to cut spending and walk away. It's to cut spending so that we could rebase ourselves and stabilize so that we could move forward and do what we're supposed to do with capital spending, tax control, and all else that goes with it. It really is very interrelated. So then, knowing that you're going to recommend cuts to the budgets that affect the parks and the buildings, how do you engage the private sector? And it was already underway here in a significant way in Scranton, with private developers taking buildings and repurposing them for infill housing downtown. You've all read about it. You've all seen some of it. Some of you might have moved yourself into some of the housing, and it's quite spectacular. And you yourselves here might not see it so much, but the story, or read about it so much, but the story of Scranton's turnaround is discussed on financial city governance panels all over the country. How a city only 5 years ago was on the verge of bankruptcy and is today on the verge of exiting after 4 decades of being in Act 47. So now it's time to begin working on continuing the relationship with both your public partners, county and state, private partners, to ensure that the buildings you have, that the parks you have, that the arts which really make a city continue to flourish and be invested in ways that are meaningful. And one last piece, at least on this segment, a lot of cities we go to, particularly newer ones that have come into distress, do not have the old buildings. And there was something about the 20s and 30s, and something about the capitalist enterprise who wanted more than just a building for their factory. They wanted their factory to be a statement. Think in terms of Scranton Lace Works. So in the 20s and 30s, the old industrial cities, where a lot of my work is, I marvel at the construction, the durability of that construction. And it's that construction which can be repurposed. It's that construction which makes good housing, makes good community space, makes good galleries, makes good museums. That's the best space to repurpose because they're jewels in and of themselves. If you go into other communities that are newer communities, buildings which were built more in the 70s, late 60s or 60s and 70s, and I don't want to be too dismissive to the 60s and 70s, though I don't value them as particularly contributory to municipal architecture. It was the time of suburban growth. Those buildings were built to simply be knocked down and replaced. Almost 35% of all shopping malls in the United States will be knocked down. They've outlived their useful purpose. Over 35%. These are urban and suburban blights, and they cannot be repurposed the way Scranton Lace Factory can. They cannot be repurposed the way some of the factories in this beautiful city can. They have to be knocked down, start from new, which dramatically changes not only the economics of the transaction for the private partner, but it also changes the sense of community and how community feels about that which it owns. And it's the city's job, whether it's publicly owned or privately owned, to be certain that those great buildings, those great parks, all those hundreds of years of thought that have gone into building cities such as Scranton are preserved. So I hope, Sandra, that's an okay answer for at least my part.
Very okay answer. So Eric, I'm going to turn to you. You're a public broadcaster, in case you forgot. I once heard Bill Moyers describe NPR as the people's university. It was that important in making the public, all people, in their kitchens, their offices, their hospital rooms, and yes, even in their prison cells, aware of what is going on in the world. Can you tell us how WVIA and you personally see and fulfill your task with regard to the arts as being a public good?
Thank you, Sandra, for the invitation. Thank you, fellow panelists. Thank you, all the representatives, Carl and Heather from the PCA, and all of you, almost all of you who have been on the other side of the art scene table talking about these very important issues. And if you haven't, on the way out, give me a card and we'll get you in to talk about what it is you do and here and what you care about. And that's so essential to what we do. But Sandra, when you mentioned what, for example, Bill Moyers said about the university, I just brought with me something that I think that we all might not have heard for a very long time, and it might be interesting to set the stage for what I might say about WVIA. And Bill Simmering is a legend in public broadcasting. He was a co-founder of NPR, and he was a developer of All Things Considered. And he was the one who set down the mission for NPR. And it's not the bullet points, NPR is this, that, and the other thing. It has a poetic ring to it. But if you haven't heard it, or if you haven't heard it for a while, it helps us set the conversation for WVIA. Simmering had it that NPR's purpose, its mission, NPR will serve the individual, will promote personal growth, it will regard the individual differences among people with respect and joy rather than derision and hate. And this is 1970. It will celebrate the human experience as infinitely varied rather than vacuous and banal. It will encourage a sense of active, constructive participation rather than apathetic helplessness. In its cultural mode, NPR will preserve and transmit the cultural past, will encourage and broadcast the work of contemporary artists, and provide listeners with an oral aesthetic experience which enriches and gives meaning to the human spirit. And he goes on to say that it will enhance intellectual development, expand knowledge, deepen oral aesthetic enjoyment, increase the pleasure of living in a pluralistic society, and result in a service to listeners which makes them more responsive, informed human beings and intelligent, responsible citizens of their communities in the world. Well, would that we could all do even just a little bit of that, but we at WVIA, I hope you know, believe that implicitly. We have a very small staff and a relatively small budget. We serve 22 different counties in southern New York and western New Jersey, but the population base is not enormous in this corner of the world, even though we reach into, with translators, the Lehigh Valley and the central Susquehanna Valley, and then the Wyoming and Lackawanna Valley and the Poconos. So by all rights, someone has said that we really shouldn't even be able to support a public radio station, but we have, and we continue to do. So with the small staff and the wonderful, loyal public members we have, we're able to do what we can to fulfill a mission like this. And so the things that we try to do that would fulfill this mission is to have conversations about fundamental things like you've raised, about what it means for a region and the arts, and how the arts and the community can work together to enhance the lives of everyone here, and what those hard choices are. So we have those kinds of conversations, and we have developed over the years a program we call Art Scene. It's a daily conversational program, Monday through Friday, and the ones that there, I can just look out and see how many of you, Nancy and Sandra and Rudy and Rosie and Bill and Jamie, you've all been on the program. And I hope you'll agree that when we sit down to talk about it, even if you're talking about an event that you want to talk about, that we get beyond the surface of when it is, where it is, how it developed. But what did it mean when Shakespeare did this and you have 10-year-olds playing Romeo and Juliet? What does that mean, coming from the background that they come up, different diversity? What does that mean, and what does that do for all of us? And what can we learn from their experience? And then how can somebody, you're doing that in Scranton, well, how can somebody in Williamsport who's listening, who won't get to see your production, how can they be part of that conversation and think about those things? So that's the kind of thing that we do in a conversational way, and we always love to have Sandra come because she is someone who has the local, the regional, the state, the national, and the international perspective, and puts all of these questions out before our listeners, and then invites our listeners to join that conversation at the University of Scranton. So those are the things that we try to do, plus all the national programs from NPR and PBS that you all love and that we wouldn't want to have.
And the music.
That's it. So,
Right.
and we have concerts, and Chris Norton, who is someone who's now been tasked with actually literally going more out into the community to make partnerships with all of us to get us more and more involved physically and not just through the airwaves.
Thank you. Mary Sue, as you know, Newark is one of my favorite cities, probably because it has addressed its challenges, and there are many of them, by including artistic excellence as one of its principal strategies for renewal. You and your late husband, historian Clement Price, were as creative and transformative as any urban leaders in making Newark a go-to destination. Can you tell us how the Art Museum and your vision for it, as well as other cultural entities, benefit the city?
Can I beg your forgiveness and use the mic, because I have,
Of course.
and try not to breathe on it.
That's okay.
But I can't project. Thank you, and I do want you to know that Henry did cut our budget when he was in. But I still like him very much, because what he did with Mayor, now Senator Cory Booker, was ensure that the city could support the museum and other entities going forward, because we had to take a big belt-tightening step. So you're a good guy, Henry. And you don't say no to Sandra and Maury. And in my life as director emerita, I've had just an interesting week. I'm actually on the search committee for my successor's successor as director of the Newark Museum. So I've heard 8 national candidates come to Newark and talk about what they would bring. And informed as they are by the national dialogue in the arts, the number one aspect is relationship to community. Probably 10 years ago, it would have been scholarship. This doesn't mean that scholarship isn't important, but it was very easy for me to do what I did as director for 20 years, because it was the museum founded by John Cotton Dana in 1909, with a building built in 1920, in that period that you were talking about, Henry. The deal was that Newark needed to educate all of these factory workers. They were a large German Jewish community making jewelry. They were a large Irish community working in the mills. They needed to really be educated and brought into the polity. And the public library, which John Cotton Dana headed first, and then the museum, which he formed out of the library, were seen as chief institutions to do this. So the deal was that Louis Bamberger, who also wanted these individuals to become conversant in design and nice living and buy things at his store, donated the building. The first families of Newark's many insurance and banking companies donated collections, which are without peer, and the city provided 100% of our operating budget. Needless to say, long before Henry came to town, there were a lot of changes in that formula. But very importantly, we always stressed that no objects were purchased with public funds other than a rare NEA purchase grant. Dana believed that an object had no value if it were not of use, which was pretty iconoclastic for the turn of the last century. And when he said of use, he meant by use by school teachers. And he was one of the very first museum directors to actually do what are now called homelands exhibits, where recent immigrant groups would exhibit first in schools and then in the museum objects that they treasured, that they had emigrated with. That was, verboten. He did the first museum exhibition of good design, long before MoMA. He did dime store, objects that cost 50 cents or less of good design, and put them on view. And then, of course, he did wonderful exhibits of Wiener Werkstatt, glassware in China. And so he really was an original person who broke down this high-low dichotomy. Because he felt that the Newark Museum should support the arts of its milieu, its community, we ended up with one of the great collections of American art, for example. So it didn't mean that access and equity was antithetical to quality and excellence. It just meant they're two sides of the same coin. And what one of our prescient mayors, Ken Gibson, said is, where Newark is going, this was in the wake of the 1967 riots, where Newark is going first, other cities will follow. And how true that was. And I would say where the Newark Museum has gone, other cities, other museums have followed. I had the 30,000 mile up view when I was president of the Art Museum Directors, and could see, I think largely because Newark represented a huge educational mission, and this idea of equity, and still an encyclopedic museum with collections that are borrowed by museums across the country and around the world, that we were able to do this unique work and not sacrifice one side for the other. So what I thought I would do in concluding my formal remarks is refer to a study that was done when I was at Art Museum Directors. We hired a firm called LaPlaca Cohen, whom you may have heard of, to do our own public relations and advise us on some of the thorny issues. I was really lucky to be the president of that group when the archaeologists were challenging us not to remove objects that were in situ in source countries and bring them to our museums. And ironically, the Newark Museum itself had returned a Greek mosaic to Apamea in Syria in the early 70s, doing the right thing, and of course in the recent war it was completely destroyed. So, it's always a little complicated. At any rate, LaPlaca Cohen has done Culture Track, first in 2011, 2014, and just the most recent version was offered up to the field in November of 2017. And some very interesting things have emerged, and they are, of course, looking at the pre-war generation, the boomer generation, Gen X, and millennials. Those are the four major groups. So what they have found is that culture has really being redefined. The meaning of culture is now sort of a disruptor to the people answering this survey, who are all what we would call culture consumers. Culture is as much about street fairs and dining experiences as it is about museum exhibitions or classical concerts or jazz or any other thing. So it's a real reassessment of experiences and services. It's a remapping, if you will, and reconceptualization of what we do and how we do it. For culture to matter, it must enable people to find or make meaning. And I would say in all the surveys we did during my directorship at the museum, that was one of the key issues, was learning about your own culture, letting other people learn about your own culture. We were sort of a cultural DMZ. We were Newark's living room. People came and shared aspects. I mean, right after 9/11, we were given a major grant by the Dodge Foundation to do a healing exhibit. And we chose to recreate a garden from medieval Spain, from the period of convivencia, when the three monotheistic religions coexisted. And the stories from that exhibit still bring chills to me, and I don't have time to tell them, but they were quite amazing. So for culture to matter, it has to enable people to find and make meaning. They want, in this particular socio-political climate, they would like culture to reduce stress, but they also want it to provide fun. And they really require a little bit more from us before they'll come in the door. A lot has been said about technology, and I'm not surprised to learn that technology is not required in a museum or other cultural experience, but if it does naturally fit with the experience, that's okay. It just shouldn't be an unnecessary, distracting add-on. Although technology now, especially Facebook, which most culture consumers seem to be on, is gaining on editorial reviews of exhibitions, concerts, and theater, which is still the #1 way people hear about coming to a cultural event, is the print media. But electronic advertising is now actually taking over from print advertising. The poor newspapers really have it coming and going. Minority audiences often use social media more than mainstream audiences because they can see themselves reflected in the social media of their friends. Loyalty is now rooted in trust, consistency, kindness, empathy, and service. People who try to do exhibits for disabled individuals, if they do them in a non-empathetic way, it's worse than not doing them at all, for example. Focused relationship building is now the most important thing. And in terms of giving, which we all need because our public budgets are going down, as they should, and we're raising money, most donors now are requiring a social return on investment. They have to believe in the mission. They're not just becoming members to get a discount or advanced sales on tickets. They really want to believe in the mission of the institution, and this is particularly true of Gen X and millennials, whose giving is beginning to become a more and more significant piece of the giving pie. So it's quite a challenge for the arts, those of you who are, and I thank you, trustees of fellow organizations. It's a challenge in any sector. Michael Cann, who's in the audience, and I sit on the board of the Delaware Highlands Conservancy. And we are trying to make our case all the time, very much the same way I made the case at the Newark Museum. So thanks, Sandra, for a chance to talk about all this.
Thanks for being here. And those of you who weren't with us should know that our last bus trip the Schemmel Forum did was to Newark, and it was the Art Museum and their wonderful New Jersey Performing Arts Center, where we had the honor to hear the London Symphony Orchestra under the baton of Simon Rattle playing Mahler. So that's Newark. Anyway, Nancy, as executive director of the NEPA Phil, you have been on the front line in struggling with the challenges of maintaining a symphony orchestra in the region. We know our story is one among many, but you and your board have rejected failure, knowing that the success of a city and region is dependent upon pockets of excellence, including artistic excellence. Tell us how your, forgive this expression, creative stubbornness has paid off.
Well, first of all, Sandra, thank you for inviting me to serve on this panel. This is some pretty wonderful voices for the arts here, and thank you for joining us. I think the best way to answer Sandra's question is to start with the history of probably the past 10 years, and this is long before I came to serve as the executive director of the Philharmonic. The Philharmonic found themselves facing deficits more and more frequently, and they would do things like many other orchestras did at the time. The solutions would be to take out loans and hope that doing the same thing the next season would get different results. And so, you know, we went through that, then another financial crisis came upon us, and then the appeals, the crisis appeals, started surfacing, and we would go to community members and say, if you don't help us, we're going to have to fold, we're going to have to go dark. And once again, 2 years ago, we found ourselves in that very position where we were facing a deficit, and we agonized over the decision about how to proceed. There were many times that our board meetings would last 4 to 5 hours, and there would be these agonizing silences where we just wanted to avoid the B word. We certainly did not want to go bankrupt. That's the B word. We didn't want to go there, but it seemed like the easiest solution after a while. It just seemed, and then one fateful board meeting, someone suggested, well, wait a minute, you know, there's an alternative to going bankrupt, and that would be to changing the look of our season for 1 year, have one concert, and then go dark. And take that moment of going dark to really assess our financial practices, our programming, our marketing, and everything that we might do to come back in a way that is sustainable. And we eventually came to a 5-year plan in which the community is a part of that. We will be, the 5-year plan has 3 phases. And within the first phase, we're learning about how sustainable the same size season is from like 2016 or 2015. And if we can't support that size season, then we'll make that decision depending on what community members do this year. So far, what we're learning is that more people have stepped up for sponsorships and grants, and we've learned that our season subscriptions are back to where they were, and we were expecting to see a real loss after a year of going dark. So the first message we're getting from the community is, yes, we want this. And we're behind you, and that's really important. We will be doing some active survey after each concert so we can get community input in how we can, A, improve, and how we can meet the needs of our community. The other thing that we believe is important is reaching out into the community, and that has to be a huge part of our mission. We do outreach into schools, and we were able, the Scranton Area Foundation funded us to continue doing that even though we were dark last year, and so we were still able to run a mentorship program for high school students. We were still able to go to Music in Our Schools visits, and those are the type of things that keep music relevant. I have to say that 2 weekends ago we spent a weekend at Glimmerglass Opera. And I looked at the gray hair. I'll just say it. I looked at the gray hair in the audience, and I realized we have the same problems as these really prestigious festivals, and that is that we are not reaching our young people. Now, there's reasons for it. In Scranton and Wilkes-Barre and the surrounding communities, music education has been severely cut in the schools, and it has been replaced. I'm going to get a little controversial when I say this, but what music education in some schools has become is marching band. And when they use a lot of financial support for marching bands, they teach discipline, they teach instruments, but what doesn't happen is giving the students a love for the aesthetic. And it's a serious problem, and teachers are starting to realize that, and they're starting to realize that we need to form a partnership if we're going to keep this beautiful art form alive. And anyone who's gone to a classical music concert or symphonic music concert or jazz knows the transformational aspect of it, that something that you can't see or hold in your hand could make you weep. And there's something incredibly important about passing that on to future generations. And so our job, that day at the board meeting when we just said, nope, we're not going to go bankrupt, we're going to try to figure this out, that was our moment of truth when we realized that we have future generations to answer to, and it's not just here and now. And there's a responsibility we have in this community for that. And so that crazy optimism that Sandra talks about, you have to have that if you're going to be in any arts organization these days. You've got to be a glass half full kind of person in order to survive. And I applaud WVIA because many NPR stations are giving in and they're not playing classical music during the day. And you're staying strong. And I think that's really important, and we all have to stick together. And that's the other thing I'd like to say. There's reason that I have hope, and Sandra has a wonderful quote about hope that maybe she'll share with us if we're lucky. But one thing that has been so beautiful about working with nonprofits in northeastern Pennsylvania is that everyone wants each other to succeed. It's not like people are going out to steal donors and things like that. We are all in it together, and so we've partnered with Meals on Wheels, with EOTC, a lot with WVIA, and it is that kind of a partnership that keeps everyone strong.
I would like to know if you panelists have questions to ask each other or comments to make, or shall we open it up to all of you who I'm sure have some questions and comments?
I just wanted to say arts education, according to the study, I'm so glad you brought it up, if somebody has an arts education experience growing up, they're 35% more likely to support and attend a cultural event.
Right.
Okay. Anything else here, or shall we, before we open it up and before I forget that wonderful quote, it's from a novelist named Nguyen, a Vietnamese who's lived in the country for about 4 years. It was in a novel that he wrote, and it was the hero, or more anti-hero, who said it was a guy who had killed a few people in the United States, and he had to leave. And he was talking about things that he would miss when he left. So he started with things like TV dinners and sexual freedom and so forth. But the end, I thought, was I think you'll enjoy. The omnipresent American narcotic, optimism. So now, how about having you join the conversation and ask some questions or have some comments? We're wide open to that. Yes.
This is just a question for Henry. So you've seen a lot of the municipal side where there's quite a bit of distress. Have you been to a city where you're just impressed because you're thinking, hey, they're really getting it right? And who might that be, and why would that be the case?
That's a good question, and a tough one, because I generally don't get to work in cities that are doing it right. I'd be out of business if they were doing it right. But we've worked on some case studies to see places, and not maybe a whole city, but places where something is working right, and it has to fit in a whole economic picture. So every state is different with how their state budgets and county and city budgets work, how their tax structure works. Many states, particularly where there are very dense populations, tend to be much more heavily taxed, and changes in tax laws even might affect the level of contributions to not-for-profits or how not-for-profits factor in people's giving plans. But one city that seems to do a lot of things right, from an economic point of view, from an arts point of view, from a housing point of view, is Austin, Texas. Is a city that's got some very interesting approaches. We're starting to follow Asheville, North Carolina, which is also very interestingly balancing the importance of arts. And what Asheville did in part to repopulate or to take advantage of what was kind of a vibrant cultural scene was to make itself very attractive to retirees, which North Carolina can more easily do than other states because its tax rate is so low, its property tax rates are so low. And so cities that have good universities, strong universities, are using those universities now as really powerful engines to transform their city. And this is mostly around places that might have some cultural aspect to them. But in each place, it needs to be studied differently because of the economic reality. It would be hard to imagine that Newark, I think, is geographically the same size as Scranton. I think Newark is 24 plus square miles. I think Scranton is 24 plus square miles. You in the 1920s were 140,000 people. Your city was built out for that. You're now 77,000 people. I think Newark hit an apex of 440,000 maybe even more. It's now somewhere just under 300,000. So when cities shrink, the cost of what was built out in the city remains. That then constrains city budget. The economics in the city changes. And then it seems almost counterintuitive, but it's more important to double down on arts, on parks, on buildings, on community, on culture, to keep those who are still there engaged, because ultimately from their creativity, the growth will pop. I might just add one more thing. I think one of you said it that triggered it in my mind. I've never been in a city where we're trying to recover and we're meeting with the city and people involved in building and development, economic development. Almost every, I think this could be over 75 to 100 places, everywhere, someone says as their first idea, because it's the best idea, where are the artists, the musicians, the authors, get them into town and people will follow. Find some old building, renovate that building, but get us the artists, get us the musicians, get us the authors, get us the poets, get us that creative class. And from it, murals start, landscaping starts, brilliant creative ideas start, and then before long, they're asking the city to fund their budget. And that's a good sign.
And it's one of its not great points. Newark, with the state of New Jersey, decided to fund the Performing Arts Center that you mentioned, having gone to. And it was not seen as much, I think, in fairness, as an artistic venue. It wasn't there to keep a discipline alive or preserve a collection. It was an engine of economic development. And truly, it made a huge difference in the succeeding rebuilding of our city, which is now almost unrecognizable in the center city. So it was very much what you're saying, this doubling down and taking a huge leap that if you build it, people will come, and they certainly have.
The question back there, and then more.
It's Mary Sue, correct? So your placement of the museum is in the downtown area, so everything's built around it, correct?
Dana specifically loved to take pot shots against the Metropolitan Museum. That was like the behemoth across the river that we weren't going to be. He wrote that he didn't want a temple in a park like the Met. He wanted right downtown. So we're on the Rutgers campus, as it turns out,
Okay.
the way Rutgers is built out.
The one point I'm like kind of asking, and this is where Henry could stop in. Right now, I actually feel like everything's split apart in the city of Scranton, as opposed to having a cultural entity that's downtown focused on the visual arts. And then there's a scaffolding between the museum at the top and the galleries at the bottom and the artists, that there's not a really good section of communication. I don't know if it might be a transition that the city needs to bring the arts more into the center, and this might be something that Henry might be able to weigh in, or if there has to be better communication between everybody.
Do you want to use the microphone to answer?
No,
Oh,
I thought that one was lobbed at you, Henry.
Oh, was it? Your city is unique, from what I've learned, and I'm a first grader, but you have very distinct sections of the city that have very deep roots into their particular section, which was very true in many cities, particularly Newark, and certainly a lot of other cities in the 40s and 50s, with however immigration happened, particularly immigration around people's ethnicities. So downtown should be the cultural center to bring people into downtown, and you want to build out a downtown, but you've got to do it in a way that has some balance where you're not undercutting here your neighborhoods in places like Newark, the wards. Not everybody's always going to have access, not everybody's going to have economic means, and beauty can't only be in just one place. It's got to be adequately dispersed. So it's a balancing, but it shouldn't be disaggregated. There should be a district, in my opinion. I think districts work well. But there should be opportunities, and not necessarily hub and spoke, but there should be opportunities in neighborhoods for neighborhoods to have their unique culture deeply ingrained in their community as well.
Yes. Not fair, Maureen, but I wondered if I might ask Maureen McGuigan to speak to follow up on this issue. You've been doing, Maureen and her department, at the county level of arts and culture, funded through a tax, unusual in the state. So you have been staging and promoting the arts in the community in downtown, and also studying the results. And I wonder, if you've had a published report, and I wondered if you could just give us a little insight into what kinds of things you're learning about the impact of those. And could you come up? Yeah. Sorry to do it, but I think
Yeah,
you might
do it
have
here.
something to
Sure.
say in this regard.
And this ties into, wow, you're done. You didn't hear me speak yet, don't know why. No, thank you, Eric. You've always been supportive. But I think it ties into, and I'm really honored to have the job at the county. We are lucky, but it's all of you in the audience and many more that have really changed it. This will echo, I think, to answer kind of Ryan's, I think what you're talking about is communication and relationship building, which I think we've made headway, but I think you're right, we still have a long way to go. Through building partnerships and making sure everybody's included in the dialogue, getting more people involved who aren't already involved. But, you know, we have to understand we have a rich, industrial, beautiful past with our ethnic heritage and our thing, but it also has a downside in a way because people were kind of in their enclaves, which is a double-edged sword. It gives us this rich community and heritage, but it also, in the modern world, you know, we're just starting, I think, to break down a lot of those silos. The county's working more with the city on streamlining things. We have a lot more events downtown. I started this job in 2008, and I can tell you, I'm staring at Michael Flint. Scranton Shakespeare is one of our new events. There's a Fringe Festival. Ryan is leading a mural thing. All that has emerged. So I think it's been a balance of both the grassroots effort and the fact that we do have some infrastructure, such as the tax. You know, we are lucky, and we try at the county to utilize that the best we can through funding organizations such as this. through offering project grants to smaller artists, to building events like the Arts Festival we just had on the weekend, to running workshops. We've now launched an Arts Engage initiative looking at how art works with other disciplines such as healthcare, veterans, drug and alcohol, mental health, because I think that's important. And I'm personally trying to get more people involved by going out and talking to people in the neighborhoods. I'm thrilled tonight we have at the dessert reception, we'll have 2 Hispanic restaurants featured. But I think it's a lot of that relationship building. It's time on task. And all of us in the room, Nancy and I are working on an initiative with Women in Transition and the new outreach EOTC to get people who might not be able to attend a concert. So I'm kind of babbling, and I don't think that there's, I think it's a messy, organic process.
But you've seen a great shift.
Yes,
And
I've seen a
measured
huge
it.
shift. Like I said, I have actual data from the
Yeah,
number of
that's
people
what's
that are now participating. Our project grants have gone up to 50 from 25 when I started, so.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I had a question for Maureen, but she stepped away from the mic. I do know that Maureen has traveled all over the world, and I know that we look to other communities and other states and other cities and try and model different models that work. But you've been able to assess this very thing in other countries. What was your number one takeaway in the various countries that you visited?
Well, thank you. Well, I had the opportunity to speak in Belgium in May about a project we did, Bonfire at the Iron Furnaces, funded by the PCA, thank you. And that was Communicating the Museum. And I learned a lot about how we can really harness the power of social media. I think that's uncharted territory, how we can get people excited about our city. And just getting back to some of these ideas of the participatory, the quote about, I'm familiar with that Culture Track study, I actually quoted it in the presentation, that people want to have fun, they want to relax, they want to feel that art is for them. So I think those, from several places I've traveled, I've seen, how do you get people are all by nature curious. When we're setting up for the festival, people are like, what's going on? So how do we capture that, and how do we keep involving people and making those connections and making art fun, relaxing, and for them? So I think that's the biggest thing. Through both in-person and through technology, I think there's a lot of different strategies to do that, but that seems to be a recurring theme, whatever country and whatever arts thing I have attended there. Thanks.
Yes, John.
I'd like to say a few words about community theater in Scranton. There's a wealth of theater. There's academic theater from the university, from Marywood, and there are all kinds of groups who give us community theater. Actors Circle and Mike Flynn's Shakespeare in the Park, and Diva, and all sorts of other groups offer a wide menu of theater, community theater, all year round, starting in the fall and then now going all the way through the summer months. I think the difficulty is that doing theater is very labor intensive and very money intensive as well. It requires lots of time, lots of money to get rights for particular performances, and then build sets, take care of lights, take care of the buildings, and so on. It is an important resource, I think, but in a way we're suffering, I think, from a profusion of venues competing for a relatively small workforce, a relatively small group of talent and time to draw upon. I think we need better communication among these groups, and we're trying to support each other's efforts now. But I think that the importance of theater should attract some more people. One of the last things that Actors Circle on Providence Road did was a production of Wit, which was about a distinguished literature professor who is suffering from cancer and going through her last months. It was an expensive show to produce because of the rights. It attracted fairly small audiences, but everyone who did come was moved and left uplifted and broadened in mind and heart for coming. And I think that people, groups like Actors Circle, have to be willing to lose money on shows like that, but they can't do that all the time. They need infusions of cash from Neil Simon plays and other more easy to digest theater and to manage their budgets successfully. So I'd like to close with a plea that if you've ever thought that you'd like to be involved in community theater, not just to be an actor or an actress, but to work behind the scenes, to take the tickets, to build the sets, to research props, and to research the theater programs themselves, the plays themselves, you have lots of venues that you can participate in.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah, okay. And there.
You may want to research this morning on NPR was a story about the importance of high school theater.
Yep.
And so it ties in arts education with young people and with the gap and how people participating, how it dwarfs anything that is done on Broadway right now.
Okay. So Bill and then Annette.
Okay, I'm listening to people talk here, and one of the things that strikes me is that I think the organizations that are involved in the arts have a tendency to look inward. They look at themselves and they know that they have problems, and they try to access the same community to support each one of those efforts. And I think that community is relatively limited. What I think theater, music, the arts need to do is they need to reach out, go, the orchestra. I have two children who were in the orchestra. I know that I went to events at their high school, they were always packed. I know that I have a child that's an artist. He was involved in art production. Those events happened at the high school, or maybe somebody sponsored him, like Marywood does the arts. Those events are always packed. So I think what needs to happen is that the arts need to move out into the community and go to the high schools and deal with that body of talent that exists in each one of those venues. And as a result of that, they have a potential to grow themselves. For instance, the regional high school orchestra, why don't they perform one of their pieces as one of the elements of the symphony that happens in Scranton? You know, the parents will be here. You know, you have a hard time filling the audience. I watched the audience diminish in size at the symphony. It seemed like each year there were more and more empty seats. You know, but I think if you can reach out and have those young people perform, you have to give them the opportunity, whether it's in music, whether it's in theater, whether it's in the visual arts, my area. And you're right, the community seems to make those things suffer first. The budgets that get cut are the music budgets, the art budgets, anything that has to do with drama. And why, I don't know. A friend of mine now passed away. Is there a problem? No. A friend of mine now passed away. We were in Pittsburgh, and he says to me, looking at the Pittsburgh plate glass buildings, he said, why would a corporation spend this kind of money building these kind of buildings? And I looked at him and I said, why are we here? You know, we're here for what the city has to offer. And whether it's buildings or music or the arts or whatever. First Friday is a beautiful event downtown. It's packed. Why don't we have second Friday, third Friday, fourth Friday?
It's expensive to mail. Well, I grew up in Pittsburgh, and that's why I have a career in the arts, because they were so accessible.
Yeah.
But one of the things that this study showed is that audiences, and this is really related to theater, sir, both want what is being performed to relate to their community, and they also want to be transported to a different time and place. So how about that for a conundrum? But what we've been doing, and again, this new generation of museum directors who's coming after me, who I participated in interviewing, we, for example, museums are doing this, and I'm sure theater, you probably did the same thing for that play. We reach out to non-traditional audiences. The community development aspect of everything we do is equal to the scholarship and the mounting of the event. So we work with medical schools and doctors using art to teach physicians better observational skills and better empathetic skills, and it goes on and on and on. So I think we are actually addressing what you're saying. It's extremely time, labor, and financially intensive to do all of that. It adds, and you're not just putting something on the wall and saying they're going to come see it. You're actually spending time to figure out new audience tracks and reach out to those people.
Well, the gentleman said it as well, or not better than what I could have said. Your arts begin in schools. And I spent 43 years in the Scranton School District doing musicals, first in junior high, middle school, and senior high school. And in fact, you're talking about performances. Michael was one of my students, and this WITS program you're talking about, another one of my students was involved in producing that. And that's where the talent comes from, that's where the talent grows. But the fear, and again, nobody gave me any money to do those shows in a senior high school. I had to raise the money myself. When I went to West Scranton High School, they had $2,500. Now, you can't go very far on that to produce a major musical. By the time I left, it was $14,000, $15,000. I can't imagine what it is at this point in time. But my husband went out and sold ads. And the year he died, one of the last years I was there, that year he raised $8,000 in ads. And we did Grease, and people like Grease. I got 3,000 people to come. And when I left there, I left them with $12,500. But they didn't give me, as I said, a penny of that. And they didn't pay me to do it after school or anything else. They gave me an extra free period. And this is what happens in schools. We don't really do anything to support the arts. And I understand now at my former high school, there's no more orchestra. There's a band that maybe has 13 or 14 people in it. And they had one teacher that did the chorus, the orchestra. When I left, we had a magnificent chorus. We had all this stuff. And gradually, you've all been reading the newspapers, and you see what they're doing to the arts. And we have this marvelous chorus at Scranton High School, and her fear is that she can't produce that chorus if they don't start in the elementary school and then go into the middle school and prepare them for high school. And so it's a tremendous need that we have, yet nobody wants to pay school taxes. I call it the dirty little secret of public education. Everybody who runs for office, whether it's the President of the United States down to the local mayor or whoever, they say the most important thing is education. And the dirty little secret is nobody wants to pay for it.
Well, I think we have to do some advocacy. We have who's here, Citizens for the Arts in Pennsylvania. Where's Jenny? Okay, there she is. I think you got to get us all charged up to do this. Any other questions? Yeah, Ryan.
Can each of you give a perspective on how tourism has influenced the arts in your community, especially Mary Sue, for new work? Because I'm not familiar with new work. And
How what? What did you ask? How what?
How tourism influences her community.
You just heard that Sandra brought the Schemmel Forum group to Newark.
Yeah.
So I don't, if, it weren't for the museum, no offense, but if it weren't for the museum and the Performing Arts Center, or our great Olmsted Park, they might not have come. So yes, I just got back from Tanglewood where I got this cold. If there was ever an example of tourism undergirded by a plethora of arts organizations, Lenox, Massachusetts, and Pittsfield, and North Adams now with Mass MoCA. It's amazing what's happening in North Adams, which was a defunct town. You could use that as a case study until the end of time.
And where's North Adams?
It's on the border of Vermont and Massachusetts, and Mass MoCA is there, and it has transformed that town.
Any other questions? Yes.
You guys, you've touched a lot on the community element of it, and also on the investment that is needed to make art a public good, create the art. I wonder if you guys could just speak at all, maybe to the art itself, that product as a public good. After the investment is done, or for lack of investment, after the energy is put in to make it into art, whether it be a building or a performance or anything else, what does that art itself mean for a community?
Well, in the interim, what are you thinking?
Well, we've been talking about the extrinsic value of art. I guess it's been implied throughout this conversation that there is an intrinsic value, and the study that I keep citing talks about the fact that people come to learn, to experience something new, to be transported to a different place and time. At the Clark Art Institute yesterday, I was transported to Paris, to the salons where women were learning that they could actually be artists, and I lived through those paintings. And my friend, the director of the New Jersey Symphony, we did an American art and music from the early 20th century, a concert and talk. And I said, Larry, it's interesting to me, the music kind of illustrates the art. And he said, oh no, it's the other way for me. So, if you don't give kids arts education early on and let them know that art is for them, the number one reason people don't walk into a museum or go to a concert, I am sure, is they think it's not for me. I've been told I can't understand this. I don't have the tools. You do not have to be a critic to sit and listen to an amazing piece of music and say, oh, Rodgers and Hammerstein ripped off that, from Dvorak, I can't remember, whatever. Anyway.
But, if you look at cities, and I referred to it earlier, the history of the city has a lot to do with art, how public art in particular, how it looks, how it feels, and there's great pride in that, and even historically. So I think we have to learn when we're in the present that just to recall that we'd like to be remembered by what we did that was brought beauty and happiness to people, rather than the fights in the city hall and all that. I think that we need to do that. I'm going to kind of start to close this. I found today a quote from a former colleague of mine, the late political theorist Benjamin Barber. So he said, the ancient agora, or civic marketplace of democratic Athens, exemplifies a spirit where public things become paramount. Entertainment and commerce are necessary and important, but they work because people are drawn to public spaces for other reasons, to play in the company of others, to watch one another and see others with fresh vision, to interact with strangers, to get out of the private space and into the commonplace. So there is a kind of urge to get that, and I would say that is very true in democracies. When you're in an autocratic country, the last place you want to be is in a public place where you feel victimized, you feel afraid. And so it's all a part of that remembering that we're in a democratic country and we have many opportunities to bring the arts, however expensive and however challenging it is, to bring the arts to people, into people's lives and into the public place. So thank you for coming. Thank the panel. Did you enjoy it?